Hey, thanks so much for stopping back by. Welcome to Bringing Home a Bishop. This is episode 2, and today we're going to touch on the history of international adoption. I think when you are looking into this world of adopting a child internationally, there's 2 important things that you need to focus on in the beginning stages of your research. Number 1, I do believe that it's really important to understand the history of international adoption. It's important to know where it's been, where it is, and where it's going, because the international adoption process is radically changing. But also that I think it's important to realize the cultural norms and differences of the countries that you're interested in adopting from. For instance, when it comes to adopting children from Eastern European countries, and this is a trigger warning, so if you have younger children that are listening, you might want to kind of put them in the other room. Probably not some things that you want to go over at this point. But in Eastern European culture and orphanages, there is a very big taboo when it comes to children that have visible or non-correctable special needs, such as Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, those types of disorders. There is a very big taboo, and sometimes that can correlate to the treatment of these children. And although the government has come a long way when it comes to making sure that these kids have what they need, there's still a very long way to go. And that's really important when choosing a country, to understand that if you are going for a child that has a non-correctable special need, that it could very much impact the way that that child has been treated for however long they've been institutionalized or in that orphanage. And so another example, for instance, and this is not meant to be a political statement or a religious statement or what have you, it's just the facts. I adopted a child in 2019 from a country up until very recently abortion was illegal, and there's a direct correlation between the abortion being illegal and being a criminal act and the high rate of children that are born with fetal alcohol syndrome or addicted to substances. I had the opportunity to listen to the president of the institution that my son was in, and she said that a lot of times mothers, when they find out that they're pregnant, they will try and induce a natural miscarriage, and they'd use substances and alcohol at some point to try and do that. And what happens is oftentimes that fails, and so that high level of alcohol and drug usage in utero creates lasting impacts for children that are then born and then later on adopted by families. So when it comes to fetal alcohol syndrome, I'm not a medical professional, but if you are looking into adopting a child that has been exposed in utero, definitely do the research that's required. There are not only physical aspects, but there are mental aspects. There are also emotional aspects of fetal alcohol syndrome. And it is a spectrum disorder very similar to autism, different but similar in that there are very low functioning, there are very high functioning children that have fetal alcohol syndrome. And sometimes you have no idea that the child has been impacted until teenage years when hormones start raging. So it's definitely worth a read. It's definitely worth the time putting in to do your research. I have adopted a child that has fetal alcohol syndrome, and so I understand the risks and I understand kind of what we're up against, but it wasn't ever something that I said, red flag, I don't think that we are ready to kind of dive into that. So going back to the actual history of international adoption, although it has been around since the 1800s, international adoption was not really widespread until 1955. And it was kind of pioneered by this couple named Bertha and Harry Holt. They were a couple from Oregon who petitioned Congress in order to get special approval to adopt 8 Korean War orphans. The Holt family actually went on to found the Holt Agency for International Adoption that has placed thousands of children in American homes since that time. In about 1992 or so, there was another spike in international adoptions. When it came to the one-child policy in China, there was a huge response from American families, because what would happen is families in China would get pregnant with a girl, and the girl couldn't carry on the family name, and so the little girl would then be placed for adoption. The family would then go on to try and have a male child. As sad as that is, it's just the reality of what adoption in different cultures look like. Going back to that cultural conversation, one of the issues that had arisen when it came to international adoption and why their adoption programs in Asia are so prevalent. It does go back to the 1990s, early 1990s. However, the number of children that have been adopted internationally has really plummeted since 2004. That was the peak of the international adoption world. Starting in, I believe it was around the 1980s, some scandals had started to surface in Latin American countries, as well as Eastern European countries. There were some child trafficking kind of things. There was some child buying things that had surfaced. There was a lot of the newfound televised documentaries, especially in the Eastern European world, when it came to the treatment of these children. So in response to that, a lot of American families, there was this like push of American families to go and save these children. And I use that term very loosely. That'll be covered in a topic later on. And so as that happened, and there were individuals in these countries that really saw this as a financial opportunity for gain. When you are looking at poverty-stricken countries, some countries such as South American countries that only live on $500 a year, you have these American families coming in that are paying upwards of $30,000 to adopt a child. There's no wonder that there's corruption. And there was no wonder that, some of these terrible things were happening. For instance, in Romania, I believe there was instances that families were actually being petitioned in the hospital after a baby was born. So family would have a child, and there would be some kind of knowledge that maybe they were not financially able to care for this child. And so they would be petitioned and really almost bribed to hand over their child so that child could then be adopted to an American family for upwards of $30,000. A large portion of that would then go to the placement agency or the agency that had secured that child. And so in response to all of that, there are some countries that had actually closed their doors to American adoption, or really international adoption at all, because it was more of a safety protocol to make sure that the children that were being adopted are actually legally adoptable. In South American countries, that gets tricky too, because, for instance, in Guatemala, a lot of those villages are still Mayan villages, and they're up in the mountains, and there's no birth record of some of those children. And so that becomes a very, very gray, sticky area, because you can't track if a child is actually legally adoptable if there's absolutely no birth record of where they come from. So those are just kind of some things that to keep in mind when it comes to the history of international adoption. The era of special needs adoption was really where we focus. It began in around the 1960s, and that really was started by a bunch of parent-led organizations that really started publicizing the need of this special group of children that were much harder to place and much harder to advocate for. And so since the 1960s, although there's been a decline in the total number of adoptions, certain organizations such as Reese's Rainbow and Rainbow Kids, those are organizations that really have done a great job at collecting files of children that have non-correctable special needs and getting those into the public so that American families can find them. And that actually is how we ended up finding our children to adopt. One was through Rainbow Kids. Our daughter was actually posted on Reese's Rainbow, but we had already seen her file prior to that happening. And so those are also some really great resources. I would encourage you to check out those websites if you are in the very early stages of deciding if this is really right for you. Also, I'll leave you with two really great book recommendations if you are in the very early stages of becoming an adoptive parent. The first one is The Body Keeps the Score. That's a great book that stems back from my first video as far as trauma in the international adoption world, or even really just the adoption world. It talks about how the body recognizes trauma no matter what the age of the child is. There's a common misconception that adopting an earlier or a younger child earlier on in life will make it easier. And that's not always the case, and that's a really dangerous misconception that I think is really kind of driving the statistic of these adoptions falling apart. Because just because you're adopting a baby doesn't mean that that baby hasn't faced trauma, and doesn't mean that that baby's body doesn't recognize that trauma. The other one that I would highly recommend is The Connected Child. It talks about all things bonding and attachment, and it's never too early to start researching those things. I'll touch on that topic a little bit later in the series also, but for now, I just wanted to leave you with a little bit of a history of international adoption. And for the consecutive episodes after this, we'll really start to dig into the process and what the process looks like and how to get started and who to call and what things that you can do in the waiting. So thank you so much for joining us, and I can't wait to see you again.